The Imperial Japanese Navy's Kaga was a one-of-a-kind aircraft carrier that not only helped define the role that such naval vessels would have in maritime warfare, but also performed as one of the greatest Japanese naval assets in World War II. Built initially as a battleship, Kaga would eventually be transformed into one of the first full-fledged aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its size, armor, and weapon systems were unique compared to Allied carriers and gave the Japanese ship an advantage when engaging in ship-to-ship battles, even when that became rarer for carriers as the war evolved. For Japan, Kaga was crucial in developing aircraft carrier doctrine and outlining the warfare strategies that would give them the massive early victories they achieved, including its central role during the Pearl Harbor attack. However, as the end of the war approached, the unique carrier found itself cornered and surpassed by American military might, and in a fierce encounter during the Battle of Midway, Japanese Fleet Commander Chuichi Nagumo was forced to make a devastating decision. Kaga was designed to be a Tosa-class battleship and was initially launched on November 17, 1921 at the Kawasaki shipyard in Kobe. A few months later, the two Tosa-class ships built by Japan were revoked and prepared to be scrapped under the terms of the recently signed Washington Naval Treaty, which severely restricted the size of naval vessels to prevent an armament race that could lead to another global-scale war. However, the treaty allowed the conversion of two giant battleships or battle cruisers that broke the pact rules into aircraft carriers of up to 34,000 tons. The unfinished battle cruisers Amagi and Akagi were initially selected, but the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 damaged Amagi's hull massively, and Kaga took her place. The official pronouncement to convert Kaga to an aircraft carrier was issued on December 13, 1923. Still, work didn't begin until 1925 due to another earthquake damaging the naval base where the modifications were to take place. The ship began a trial period to test her seaworthiness on March 31, 1928. After succeeding, she joined the combined fleet under Commander Rengo Kantai on November 30, 1929, as the Imperial Japanese Navy's third carrier to enter service. After the significant modifications, Kaga measured 782 feet from stern to bow. She had a 103-foot-long beam and was able to displace 27,300 tons of water at standard load and 34,234 tons at full load, nearly 6,100 tons less than her design displacement as a battleship. Kaga was manned by a total of 1,340 crew members. Two aspects made her aesthetically and functionally unique: the three superimposed flight deck disposition and her exhaust vent system. Then, as the ship was transformed into a carrier, the ejection of exhaust gases became a particularly delicate issue. The Japanese tested two possible fixes. One was used on Kaga and the other on her sister Akagi. Kaga's system consisted of two long horizontal ducts that discharged gases at the rear of each side of the flight deck. The system was built despite predictions by several naval engineers that they would not maintain the hot gases away from the deck. The naval architects were correct, as the gases would not evacuate the ship efficiently, thus making Kaga slower than Akagi. Furthermore, the gases would often rise and interfere with landing operations, and the heat would make the cruise quarters on the side of the ship almost uninhabitable. Besides the infamous Japanese exhaust vent system, the ships were constructed with three superimposed flight decks that gave the vessels their unique look. No other ship in the world used three flight decks. The primary flight deck was 561 feet 8 inches long and 100 feet wide. The middle flight deck was 49 feet 3 inches long, and her lower flight deck was approximately 180 feet 5 inches long. The decks were supposed to provide significant versatility, as lighter rescue aircraft could take off from the smaller ones, and larger combat ones could use the large landing platform. However, the middle deck was too small even for the lightest aircraft to take off, rendering it almost useless. The issue would become even more significant as World War II dragged on with the addition of heavier and larger aerial fleets. When completed, the ship had two main hangar decks and a third auxiliary hangar, with a maximum aircraft capacity of 60 air vehicles. In addition, she was powered by 4 Kawasaki Brown Curtis geared steam turbines with a total of 91,000 shaft horsepower, able to move the vessel at a maximum of 32 miles per hour. Kaga was armed with 10 third-year type 20cm 50 caliber guns, 1 twin-gun Model B turret on each side of the middle flight deck, and 6 armored casemates in the rear section. The decision about which weapons to fit into Kaga was made when aircraft carrier doctrine was still in its earliest stages. Hence, priority was given to guns that would perform better against ship-to-ship combat, while not providing enough anti-aircraft coverage. Vulnerability to aircraft attacks was partially improved during the second phase of significant reconstruction, in which 6 twin 4.7-inch 10th-year type Model A2 guns were added, and the 3-deck configuration was replaced with a single large deck. To achieve this, the 2 old decks were converted to hangars, allowing Kaga to carry over 80 combat planes. However, the supposed improvement backfired, as the new deck design obstructed the anti-aircraft gun's full range, preserving the carrier's vulnerability to airborne assaults. Kaga's early combat experiences occurred during the Sino-Japanese War, in which the aircraft carrier was used against a technologically inferior naval force. The encounters with Chinese troops were limited to small dogfights, where the superior Japanese planes would often come up victorious. The carrier was also used to deploy aircraft strikes to disrupt Chinese supply lines and railroad tracks, providing Japanese air forces with a comfortable air superiority during their extended campaigns on Chinese territories. The Japanese soon became overconfident in their carrier's capabilities, as they could deal devastating destruction in a short time while not suffering significant damage from counterattacks. However, Japan could not grasp the seriousness of their carrier's flaws, specifically their crippling anti-aircraft performance that would soon make them an easy target for Allied airborne attacks. Although Kaga provided remarkable firepower, it lacked an early warning system and an active radar. To make matters worse, the communication systems were rudimentary, and the still developing carrier doctrine didn't consider adequate protocols to deal with incoming aircraft attacks. Mark Peaty, a Japanologist specialized in modern Japanese military, would call the Japanese carrier force, quote, a glass jaw. It could throw a punch, but couldn't take one. The attack on Pearl Harbor would extend the Japanese Navy's confidence in their carriers, including Kaga. On November 17, 1941, under the command of Captain Jisaku Okada, Kaga was armed with 100 torpedoes at Saiki Bay in Hiroshima. These specially designed torpedoes had been constructed to perform in the shallow waters of the Pearl Harbor waterfront. 2 days later, Kaga and the rest of the combined fleet strike force under Chuichi Nagumo assembled it at Orofu Island. The fleet then departed on November 26th and furtively crossed the Pacific while avoiding trade routes. Kaga was a crucial part of the attack on Pearl Harbor, as the vessel carried 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, 27 Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, and 27 Aichi D3A dive bombers, plus 3 crated aircraft of each type. On the morning of December 7, 1941, these aircraft were part of the first strike force to attack Oahu, amounting to 1/5 of the total aircraft that attacked the Hawaiian base. The aircraft that took off from Kaga claimed hits on Nevada, Oklahoma, Arizona, California, West Virginia, and Maryland, while the Japanese fighter pilots claimed to have destroyed 21 American aircraft. After the strike, all 6 Japanese carriers withdrew from the area and returned to Japan. For Kaga and her crew, the day had been a colossal success. For the following months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese war efforts were highly successful, and they were able to capture extensive resourceful territories in Southeast Asia while keeping the Allied superpowers at bay. Still, the Japanese Empire knew that it was only a matter of time for America's unparalleled industry to assemble a massive fleet that could overwhelm them. The Japanese then thought of launching another surprise attack on U.S. soil and finishing off their Pacific fleet, specifically their aircraft carriers. That could be enough leverage to force their enemies onto the negotiating table and achieve peace before they could build more vehicles. However, the remaining U.S. carriers in the Pacific were stationed in heavily defended Pearl Harbor, so Japan would need to lure them out and destroy them. A surprise attack on the U.S. base at Midway was then planned, and a fleet consisting of 4 of Japan's most important aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with several destroyers and cruisers, departed from Japan and spread out across the Pacific to reduce the chance of being discovered, traveling to Midway in complete radio silence. However, despite all their efforts, the American troops cracked their communication code and were aware of the incoming attack almost a month before it happened. The naval battle that ensued would become one of the most consequential encounters in World War II. After the deceptive first phase, where the Japanese seemed to outmaneuver all American attempts to sink their carriers, the mighty Japanese Zeros providing the defense to the Japanese fleet ran out of fuel and ammunition. U.S. commanders took advantage and launched a massive airstrike that finally disabled 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. Kaga was hit by 4 huge bombs and was soon engulfed by uncontrollable fire. Captain Jisaku Okada immediately perished with the initial strike, and the fires spreading through the carrier trapped most of the crew below deck, making it impossible to escape. Fleet Commander Chuichi Nagumo then made the difficult decision to scuttle the 3 damaged carriers using torpedoes. Thus, Kaga was finished off by her own comrades, while hundreds of sailors were still trapped in it. U.S. forces would soon disable Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, marking an utter defeat for Japan. 811 Japanese sailors ultimately lost their lives aboard Kaga, and the surviving minority were taken back to Japan and quarantined for almost a year in a desperate effort to prevent the Japanese public from learning about the disastrous defeat. Instead of forcing America to reclaim peace, Japan lost a colossal part of its primary attack force during the battle, and the Empire was forced to fight a defensive war from then on. America's confidence was bolstered, and the war's outcome was written. The Colossus Graf Zeppelin was a German aircraft carrier armed with over 60 guns and room for over 1,700 people and 60 aircraft. It was widely regarded as the definitive German vehicle that could have turned the tide of the war. Impressively enough, most world superpowers had plenty of aircraft carriers participating in the war, but the technologically advanced Germany didn't. Hitler and his admirals eventually envisioned 4 aircraft carriers that were going to be built and finished by 1947 as part of the naval expansion of the Kriegsmarine. However, the early breakout of the war forced the Wehrmacht to focus on more pressing matters, leaving the project to the side. Graf Zeppelin, the incomplete 33,000-ton lead ship in a class of 2 carriers, would remain stationed in Poland for almost 2 years. It wouldn't be until the war raged on, and aircraft carriers from other nations played a pivotal role in winning crucial battles, that Hitler ordered the Kriegsmarine to carry on with the project. It was now a race against time. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, humiliated all of Germany, especially its military. The country was now forbidden from developing military technology, and the war industry quickly vanished. Worst of all, the German armed forces were reduced to a mere 100,000 men, resembling more of a police force than a proper army. The country was pretty much left defenseless against other foreign powers, and coupled with the economic downfall, social unrest followed. The naval branch of the German armed forces, or Kriegsmarine, suffered the most, as they were forbidden to develop warships or dreadnoughts like the ones the British and French had. The Kriegsmarine was only allowed to upgrade pre-dreadnought battleships with a maximum tonnage of 10,000 tons. Like their ground counterpart, the German Navy was defenseless against any other European power. However, German engineers managed to work around the restrictions imposed by the Kriegsmarine and came up with the idea of pocket battleships. Although the German rearmament was already underway before 1933, Adolf Hitler was committed to fully supporting the military, including the creation of a worthy navy. He wanted all branches of the military to return to their former glory. Born again as the Kriegsmarine, the first objective was to produce a small but capable force to challenge the British and French naval powers. At first it seemed unlikely, but the German industry kept working under the patronage of the Third Reich. Although all the global powers from the First World War had signed the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty to limit an arms race of naval nature, only a few actually obliged. The treaty established a tonnage limit to naval vessels, but it was repeatedly altered to fit the interest of the Allied victors. This led the Third Reich to negotiate the Anglo-German Naval Agreement to grant permission to construct heavier vessels for the Kriegsmarine. On April 1, 1939, Hitler presented Admiral Erich Raeder as the Kriegsmarine's chief to the military staff during a gala ceremony aboard Scharnhorst, a new battlecruiser anchored at Jade Bay, Wilhelmshaven. During the ceremony, Hitler brought up Plan Z, a strategy to expand the Navy and be able to finally challenge the British and French navies. Both Hitler and Raeder dreamt of building a naval force with 10 battleships, 4 aircraft carriers, 15 pocket battleships, 250 U-boats, and more than 100 destroyers and cruisers. The plan was achievable, but only in the long run, as the fleet could not be completed until 1948. Still, the Führer was delighted. However, Britain and France declared war against Germany after the annexation of Poland in September of 1939, and at this time, the Kriegsmarine was not even at its minimal combat readiness. There was no way Germany could beat the combined fleets of France and Britain with what they had, so the top brass was forced to come up with unconventional ideas. Admiral Raeder only had the Bismarck and Tirpitz 15-inch gun battleships at his disposal, 3 11-inch gun pocket battleships, 2 8-inch gun heavy cruisers, 2 11-inch gun battlecruisers, 34 destroyers, over 60 U-boats, and not a single aircraft carrier. The clock was ticking, and the Kriegsmarine had to hurry to finish the only aircraft carrier it had begun building in 1935, the Graf Zeppelin. While most world navies began converting ships into aircraft carriers before the end of World War I, Germany would join them too late in the game because of the restrictions imposed on its armed forces. Still, after negotiating with its adversaries the disclosure of the naval agreement, Hitler approved the construction of the Navy's first aircraft carrier on November 16, 1935. The ship was awarded to the Deutsche Werk shipyard in Kiel as aircraft carrier A and laid down in December of 1936 after work on the Gneisenau battleship was finished. The carrier was named after Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who had risen to fame for creating the colossal dirigibles made famous during World War I. Graf Zeppelin would not be launched until December 8, 1938, during the anniversary of the Battle of the Falkland Islands. She was christened by von Zeppelin's daughter, Helen. The aircraft carrier was 262 meters long and had a beam of 36 meters, with a maximum draft of 8.5 meters. Fully loaded, Graf Zeppelin displaced 33,550 long tons and was intended to be manned by a crew of 1,760 sailors plus flight crews. Her propulsion consisted of 4 Brown Bavarian Sea geared turbines with 16 Lamont boilers. The ship's power plant generated over 200,000 shaft power, which translated to a top speed of almost 62 kilometers per hour. Still, by traveling at about 30 kilometers per hour, Graf Zeppelin's range could render almost 15,000 kilometers of range. When it came to armor, the carrier's flight deck was protected by 45 millimeters of Wotan Weich steel armor, the main deck by 60, and the waterline armor belt was 100 millimeters thick. Graf Zeppelin would carry substantial armament for its time, including 8 or 16 15-centimeter SK-C-28 guns for defense against surface warships. This unique combination was meant to use Graf Zeppelin in a more offensive role to attack cruisers, destroyers, and merchant vessels, and support the aircraft that she would be carrying. Additionally, Graf Zeppelin's anti-aircraft defenses comprised 12 10.5-centimeter SK-C-33 guns, 22 3.7-centimeter SK-C-30 guns, and 28 flak guns. By mid-1939, the aircraft carrier was almost 80% complete. Expectations were high, and it was estimated that she would be finished by the end of 1940. Pilot training and development of specific aircraft adapted to the carrier began in 1938. The responsibility of these 2 tasks fell to the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. However, Göring was not keen on cooperating, as he wished to keep control of every single project in which aircraft were involved. Ultimately, the intention was to house 20 Fi-167 biplane torpedo bombers, 10 Bf-109 fighters, and 13 Stukas aboard Graf Zeppelin, or else create an exclusive aircraft for carrier operations. Unfortunately for the Kriegsmarine, once the war broke out in September of 1939, the Wehrmacht resources began to run out, and the project quickly stalled. During the initial stages of the conquest of Norway in April of 1940, Admiral Raeder proposed Hitler to halt the construction of Graf Zeppelin. The reason was simple. Although the carrier was almost complete, it would take another 10 months to install all of her guns. By then, the Kriegsmarine was in urgent need of coastal batteries and anti-aircraft guns to protect the Norwegian coastline, which comprised several port facilities, including the future U-boat pens. The Führer agreed and allowed Raeder to remove the few guns that had already been installed on Graf Zeppelin. Months later, in July of 1940, the carrier was towed to Gdynia and used as a storage depot for timber until 1942. During this period, the usefulness of aircraft carriers was repeatedly proven on the seas. In November of 1940, the British decimated the Italian base at Taranto with a task force of Swordfish aircraft that took off from Royal Navy carriers. Then, in May of 1941, Bismarck and Tirpitz were heavily damaged by fire from British aircraft that did the same. More importantly, Japanese carriers were essential in the surprise attack against the United States in Pearl Harbor. In May of 1942, Hitler ordered Raeder to resume work on Graf Zeppelin, but several branch problems prevented this from happening. To start off, Raeder wanted new and specially designed aircraft for carrier use, but Göring argued that it was impossible to do so because the aircraft industry was already overwhelmed with aircraft production to help on various fronts. Instead, Göring suggested converting existing Bf-109s and Ju-87s, and this led to more changes to the existing structure of Graf Zeppelin. The modifications began immediately, and it appeared that the carrier might be finished after all. However, Hitler suddenly replaced Admiral Raeder with submarine expert Karl Dönitz as the head of the Kriegsmarine. With the war slowly turning in favor of the Allied forces, and Germany losing the supremacy of the seas, Dönitz convinced Hitler to stop working on any type of surface ship and focus those valuable resources on producing U-boats. Work on Graf Zeppelin was suspended once again in January of 1943, and the carrier was transferred to Stettin in Poland. The mighty carrier languished for 2 years, until in April of 1945, its crew decided to flood it to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Soviets. The Germans believed that Graf Zeppelin would never float again, but the Soviets had other plans and refloated it for inspection. After taking away every valuable item and being used to simulate an air attack on an American aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin was sunk in July of 1947. For decades, historians speculated about where the only aircraft carrier produced by the Third Reich was sunk, but nobody knew, even the Soviets. It was not until 2006 that a Polish vessel from an oil company found the wreckage of a 265-meter-long ship, 55 kilometers north of Władysławowo. The Polish Navy quickly sent a team of divers to verify the ship's identity and were amazed at the discovery. It was the long-forgotten Graf Zeppelin, Hitler's first and last aircraft carrier. After 2 months patrolling the Pacific, the Gato-class USS Wahoo submarine had exhibited an underwhelming performance. She had missed an opportunity to engage a Japanese seaplane tender and an aircraft carrier, both precious targets, and had also missed every single torpedo shot she fired. Even fishing boats had escaped her grasp. Wahoo's commander was eventually relieved of his post, and the new one, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker Mush Morton, was determined to turn the tides on the submarine's legacy. For the following months, USS Wahoo became one of the most aggressive and formidable American submarines serving in World War II. Her fearless assaults, unrelenting pursuits, and ruthless approach to combat soon became the subject of much fear within the Japanese Navy. However, Morton and his crew would soon deliver a blow so devastating that it would enrage the enemy to the point of no return. At the height of her run, Wahoo's success would become her undoing. The first Gato-class submarine, USS Drum, was commissioned in 1941, and by the time the U.S. entered World War II, she was the only vessel of her sort in the American Navy ranks. Still, the class became the most advanced mass-produced submarine in the war. They were enormous vessels, armed with up to 24 torpedoes, and with a comfortable range of over 20,000 kilometers. As they left American ports for the first time, they were much more powerful than anything the enemy could throw at them. In contrast to the hundreds of Type 7 German U-boats being constructed by the Wehrmacht, Gato-class submarines were limited in numbers, with only 77 being built throughout the war. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in formidable performance and raw power. Launched in February of 1942 and commissioned 3 months later under the command of Lieutenant Commander Marvin G. Pinky Kennedy, USS Wahoo would be one of the first Gato-class submarines to be tested in the Pacific theater. As a remarkable feat of American engineering, the U.S. Navy expected much from Wahoo and her crew. She and other submarines of her kind had the critical task of strangling the Japanese islands and depriving them of strategic supplies. As such, Wahoo departed Mare Island on August 12th after a training phase along the California coast, arriving at Pearl Harbor on August 18th. 3 days later, she was ready to sail for war. The first 2 patrols conducted by Wahoo and her crew were highly disappointing, but her lackluster performance was blamed on the poor leadership of Commander Kennedy and the abysmal performance of the Mark 14 torpedoes she was armed with. Wahoo's first encounter happened west of Truk. On September 6, 1942, she spotted a lone freighter and fired 3 torpedoes at her, but all of them missed. The Japanese ship swiftly turned to face the submarine. but she increased her speed to attempt to ram the American submarine, and Wahoo quickly dove. She then withdrew from the area, fearing an air attack. Then, on September 20th, Wahoo sighted a freighter and her escort. She fired 3 torpedoes, but again, none hit their mark. A 4th projectile finally hit the target, but Wahoo was immediately pursued by the escort, only managing to escape after drastically changing course in a rain squall and losing her attacker. In the first week of October, Wahoo encountered the seaplane tender Chiyoda and a sizable Japanese aircraft carrier. Sinking either of those 2 vessels would have been a monumental victory for the American submarine. However, a lack of decisiveness and a tactically deficient approach led to both ships escaping unharmed. 2 months later, during a second patrol commanded by Kennedy, Wahoo ran across a convoy of 3 loaded cargo ships escorted by a destroyer. The submarine was not able to get into a firing position, and as a result, Kennedy decided to target the largest tanker instead, unleashing 4 torpedoes from a range of 700 yards. 3 of the projectiles hit their target, but none of the strikes caused the desired damage, taking the Japanese ship over 2 hours to sink. After returning from her second patrol and assessing the poor results the Wahoo had achieved, Kennedy was relieved from command, and his post was given to Lieutenant Commander Dudley Walker "Mush" Morton. Morton had a very different philosophy to submarine warfare, and he had no intentions of displaying hesitance when engaging enemy ships. His first action was to assemble the crew, and in a brief but legendary address, he told them that from now on, Wahoo was expendable, and they would battle under that assumption. If anyone wanted to stay behind, they could do so without consequences. Following the speech, everyone stayed on board. On January 26th, Morton spotted a large tanker ship and a freighter, immediately firing 4 torpedoes. The tanker began to sink, but the freighter then rushed toward Wahoo in an attempt to ram her as she fired her deck gun. Morton ignored the incoming ship. Instead, he targeted 2 recently spotted cargo vessels that were part of the convoy, managing to strike one of the tankers as she attempted to flee. Soon, the damaged freighter was practically on top of the American submarine, and Wahoo immediately launched 2 torpedoes. The first one missed, but the second one hit the target. However, the freighter kept charging at Wahoo and forcing Morton to turn hard at the last minute to avoid being rammed. Not willing to waste a second, Morton then turned back and targeted the damaged tanker that had been hit first. One of the 2 fire torpedoes exploded in the ship's midsection, and the vessel quickly sank. The damaged freighter and the other surviving tanker then met at a distance and began withdrawing together. Meanwhile, the sailors from the other sunken ships began to deploy lifeboats. In a controversial move, Morton then ordered his crew to attack the Japanese sailors aboard their lifeboats. Morton claimed some of them were using machine gun fire against Wahoo and that he only wanted to sink the boats. It was later revealed that most of the people on the lifeboats were Indian prisoners of war of the 2nd Battalion, 16th Punjab Regiment. After forcing the POWs and the Japanese sailors off their lifeboats, Morton dashed towards the fleeing and ravaged ships. The commander only had 4 torpedoes left, and he had to make them count. Wahoo engaged the tanker first, firing 2 torpedoes at her. The first missed, while the second carved a hole just aft of midships, obliterating her rear and sinking her almost instantly. To completely destroy the convoy, Wahoo targeted the damaged freighter and fired her last 2 projectiles at the fleeing ship, with both of them reaching their mark. 15 minutes later, after having sustained 4 torpedo strikes, the freighter finally sank. Despite the ruthlessness of his approach, Morton would continue to show impressive results while commanding Wahoo. On January 27, 1943, the crew spotted a convoy of 8 ships, including 2 freighters and a tanker. With not a single torpedo left, Morton employed a creative strategy to assault the ships. Seeing that the tanker was unarmed and appeared to be having a mechanical malfunction, Morton opted to surface behind her to send the convoy into a panic. The idea was to use her deck gun to sink the tanker after the convoy broke up. Everything seemed to be going according to plan when a Japanese destroyer escort suddenly charged out of a rain squall, forcing Morton to retreat. Still, the commander and his aggressive crew would continue to strike terror into the hearts of Japanese sailors, often engaging them with their deck guns when they ran out of torpedoes. Moreover, Wahoo was the only U.S. submarine to venture into the Sea of Japan before the final months of the war, and she broke a U.S. Navy record by sinking a total of 94,776 tons in only 25 patrol days. In a cruel twist of fate, Wahoo's unparalleled success would lead to her demise. On October 5, 1943, Morton and his crew ambushed the Army transport steamer Kontran-Maru and swiftly destroyed her. Only 72 of the 616 passengers survived. The attack enraged the Imperial Japanese High Command, especially because 2 Japanese congressmen of the House of Representatives were among the victims. In response, the Japanese government unleashed a devastating campaign to hunt down every U.S. submarine close to their main island. On October 11th, when Wahoo was supposed to leave her patrol area, an Aichi Jake float plane sighted a wake and an apparent oil slick from a submerged submarine. A massive Japanese anti-submarine operation was immediately concocted, and the submarine was now engaged by sea and air, with the Japanese forces dropping hundreds of depth charges for several hours. Wahoo would never make it home, and she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on December 6, 1943. It would not be until 2006 that it was discovered that Wahoo was sunk by an aerial bomb near the conning tower. A year later, the U.S. Navy held a wreath-laying ceremony for the fallen crew at the wreck's exact location. During the tense and secretive days of the Cold War, submarine technology evolved exponentially, as the Americans and Soviets pushed each other forward in a never-ending race for naval supremacy. But while already discreet about the so-called silent service, most American developments remain classified to this day, and the U.S. Navy is particularly reticent about its Seawolf class. Originally intended as the most advanced undersea attack vessels, the U.S. government axed the program when the Cold War ended and the threat of high-tech Soviet submarines evaporated. However, the youngest of the class's sisters, the infamous USS Jimmy Carter, would continue with her family's heritage and become one of the stealthiest Pentagon spies, so much so that the U.S. Navy has barely recognized her capabilities other than for basic submarine roles. Still, the facade is evident, and there are several pieces of evidence that point to her crucial part in more dangerous and mysterious missions. In early 2013, Jimmy Carter sailed from her home port in Washington and reappeared roughly 2 months later after a mysterious operation that earned her a Presidential Unit citation, with both experts and the public alike trying to piece out the true nature of the endeavor by putting together the clues. In 1983, design work began for a new type of submarine to succeed the Los Angeles class. The Seawolf nuclear-powered fast attack design was conceived to combat the increasing threat of ever more advanced Soviet ballistic missile submarines. Conceptualized for deep ocean environments, the Seawolf's hull was constructed from HY-100 steel, stronger than the previous HY-80. This newer metal could withstand water pressure at greater depths. Larger, faster, and significantly quieter than its predecessor, the Seawolf had a broader host of weapons, as well as twice as many torpedo tubes for her Mark 48 torpedoes. In fact, her ships had the capacity to carry 50 UGM-109 Tomahawk cruise missiles for both land and sea surface targets. In addition, their extensive equipment allowed for shallow water operations, as this class featured an advanced Archi-modified AN/BSY-2 combat system with an enhanced spherical sonar array, a wide aperture array, and a new towed array sonar. Moreover, the submarines were powered by an S-6W nuclear reactor of 45,000 horsepower, which drove a low-noise pump jet. The Seawolf's advanced design resulted in a particularly high cost, and at $3 billion per unit, the model became the most expensive nuclear-powered attack submarine, and the second most expensive submarine in history, only surpassed by the French nuclear-powered ballistic missile Triomphant class. The original plan called for 29 submarines to be built over a decade, but that amount was eventually reduced to 12. As the Cold War ended and budget constraints took over, further additions to the fleet were cancelled in 1995. Only 3 Seawolf-class submarines were ever built. The first 2 models, Seawolf and Connecticut, were launched and commissioned in the late 1990s, while the third, Jimmy Carter, was not launched until the 2000s. The 3 sisters were eventually grouped together as the core of submarine development Squadron 5, which is currently responsible for testing contemporary underwater listening gear and remote-controlled submersibles, either tethered or autonomous. Likewise, the squadron is developing innovative Arctic fighting tactics to take advantage of the site's natural properties that allow underwater vessels to hide from their opponents. However, the unit is not on the record as being involved in intelligence gathering. Despite the team's designation implying an innocent experimental function, it is not uncommon for the U.S. Navy to use such monikers for special or elite groups. And after costing $3.5 billion and undergoing several modifications to comply with her unique role, USS Jimmy Carter forms part of a particular subclass altogether, one that, more likely than not, makes it the Pentagon's most stealthy spy submarine. In the summer of 1996, General Dynamics Corporation's Electric Boat Division was awarded a contract to build the third example of the Seawolf class. But the extensive modifications he received later departed significantly from the original design, making Jimmy Carter one of a kind. The unique boat was named after the 39th President of the United States, who notably was the only one to have qualified on submarines. Furthermore, Jimmy Carter is the only submarine named after a living president, and among the few in the current U.S. inventory to have the name of a living person. Her keel was laid down in late 1998, and her commission was scheduled for late 2001 or early 2002. Along the way, Electric Boat received an extension of no less than $887 million to enhance the submarine and test new systems, so that she could carry out more unique and classified missions, such as the ones her distinguished predecessor, USS Parche, used to perform. Jimmy Carter's hull was then extended by 100 feet, creating a 2,500-ton supplementary module, and her hourglass-shaped middle section, which formed an enigmatic multi-mission platform, or MMP, not only allowed for an assortment of operations, but also fueled several theories about its actual use. The section features an ocean interface for divers, remotely operated vehicles, special operation equipment, ROV handling systems, storage, and deployment space for mission systems. Plus, the ship was fitted with a pressure-resistant passage between the fore and aft areas for crew accommodation. Still, beyond allowing the launch and recovery of remotely operated underwater vehicles and Navy SEALs, it is said that the platform may have other purposes while carrying out secretive missions. Authors Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew, who co-wrote Blind Man's Bluff, The Untold Story of American Submarine Espionage, argued that the expanded midsection would house the same gear as USS Parche, while intelligence experts have speculated that the platform may also be used as an underwater splicing chamber to tap undersea fiber optic cables. In addition, Jimmy Carter was outfitted with custom-made thrusters that help her stabilize above a target and stay stationary even in extreme currents. This way, the ship could easily maneuver while planting listening devices on the ocean floor. The submarine was christened on June 5, 2004 by former First Lady Rosalind Carter, and she completed Alpha Sea trials in November. The following month, Electric Boat delivered the vessel to the U.S. Navy, and she was commissioned in February of 2005, 6 years after her older sister, and right behind the first Virginia-class model. Despite her late entrance into operational status, the changes Jimmy Carter endured would guarantee a more exciting and mysterious career than most submarines. However, as of today, drones and SEAL deployment capabilities are the only uses the Navy is willing to admit. In early 2013, the 150 crew members on board Jimmy Carter left their home port and then sailed for 2 months from Bangor in Washington to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Whatever her mission was, it earned the vessel a repair intermission and a Presidential Unit citation. While every year the units on land, air, and sea must turn over a historical report to the Naval History and Heritage Command, there's no requirement that they go into any specific detail. The ship's official annual history only refers to the event as Mission 7, but the document does note that, quote, performed under a wide range of adverse and extremely stressful conditions without external support, this deployment continued USS Jimmy Carter's tradition of excellence in pursuit of vital national security goals. Moreover, the honorable distinction requires, quote, extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy. Still, the mission was given as much attention as a summer picnic or the crew's Halloween party. Even though the Presidential Unit citation for the sailing branch is comparable to bestowing the ship with a Navy Cross, exactly what the crew of 150 did is merely described by the Secretary of the Navy as, quote, extremely difficult and hazardous. To add to the mystery, the task was executed alongside sailors from the even more secretive Detachment Undersea Research and Development. As reported in the memo, both units, quote, successfully completed extremely demanding and arduous independent submarine operations of vital importance to the national security of the United States, and overcame numerous obstacles to safely execute these demanding and complex tasks without incident. In addition to the report, 2 attachment pictures have also added to the speculations. The photos show Jimmy Carter's captain, Commander Brian Elkwowitz, and other officers displaying the framed citation. And in both, an individual's face is blacked out. The files in question were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by the War is Boring platform. Most likely, Jimmy Carter has taken over USS Parchee's previous mission to tap undersea fiber optic communications in the same manner the former spy submarine used to do with obsolete Soviet copper lines. However, given the Navy's highly secretive attitude towards the Seawolf family, the younger sister's records are closer to a series of rumors than an actual binnacle of activities. While Sontag and Drew published their book before Jimmy Carter was even finished, the Navy and its partners have had plenty of time to improve the vessel further. In 2001, when General Dynamics was still assembling the submarine, NSA Director Lieutenant General Michael Hayton laughed off rumors about breaking into undersea cables during an interview with the Wall Street Journal. Before refusing to discuss the matter altogether, he stated, quote, I'm not going to sit here and dissuade you from your views. 20 years later, and after an apparent, decidedly active service, not much else has been unveiled about the submarine or her operations. When Jimmy Carter finally returned to her home port in 2017, she was flying the Jolly Roger flag alongside the Stars and Stripes one, a centenary tradition that indicates she successfully completed her mission. Still, it may take a century before the public learns what that mission was in the first place. Conventional U-boat submarines had been the backbone of the Kriegsmarine during the early stages of World War II. Still, as Allies developed more prominent and more powerful fleets, the outdated German submarines drastically lost the battle. Karl Dönitz, the supreme commander of the Kriegsmarine, knew that if they didn't attain maritime supremacy in the Atlantic, Germany would lose the war. Quote, only a U-boat which no longer needed to surface in order to recharge batteries, and which had both high speed and long endurance underwater, could improve our prospects in the battle ahead. Dönitz's words were more than wishful thinking. By 1942, the unprecedented submarine he described was already being developed with the utmost urgency, and Hitler himself overviewed the development. The Type 21 submarine became a Nazi wonder weapon developed in the latter stages of World War II, one of only a few infamous Wunderwaffes actually built. It is also credited as the first real submarine in history, as previous U-boats were designed to submerge only during short periods and had to resurface constantly to recharge their batteries, making them easy targets for Allied war efforts and considered mostly as submersible ships. In contrast, Type 21 was the first vessel in the world that could stay underwater indefinitely while reaching unparalleled depths, revolutionizing the way submarines were developed from then on. The submarine came on the heels of subsequent Allied victories in the Atlantic, and Dönitz hoped for a massive overturn based entirely on the deployment of the mighty Type 21 submarine. It was now a race against the clock, and the only shot the Nazis had at winning the war. World War II was defined by the Battle of the Atlantic, as the Axis powers had to cut off Britain's naval supply lines from America, and the Allies had to defend them at all costs. If Hitler could starve Britain from war supplies and avoid the US from entering the war, Europe would fall. After successfully conquering France, Germany achieved free access to the Atlantic, deploying its furtive and fearsome U-boats to wreak havoc on Allied supply convoys. The deceptive vessels proved to be a nightmare for Allied mariners at the beginning of the conflict. However, not all events unfolded according to the Axis plans. Thanks to the fantastic efforts of the Royal Canadian Navy, Germany was unable to quickly isolate Britain from its resource lines as it had planned. As pioneers in the technology, the Germans had been using submersible U-boats since the dawn of World War I. The unique capabilities of their ships gave them an enormous advantage in sea warfare for over 3 decades. But as World War II evolved, the German U-boats began to show their limits. In fact, during the latter stages of the war, the once feared U-boats were being shredded to pieces by the now modernized British and Canadian navies. By 1943, Karl Dönitz knew that defeat was imminent not only in the Atlantic, but across every battlefront. Still, Germany had one ace under its sleeve. As with many other advantages from the Third Reich, it revolved around their technological superiority. Due to their vast experience with submersible vessels, the Nazis spearheaded the world's innovations in submarine technology, and research into the technology necessary to develop a submarine capable of staying underwater for more extended periods had been a priority for German scientists for several years. Before the outbreak of World War II, Professor Helmut Walter, a brilliant German submarine designer, had devised the outline of a powerful U-boat capable of conducting war without having to resurface. While only outlined as a theory, Walter's design solved the problem of having to resurface to charge up batteries by envisioning a system based on steam turbines instead of electric engines. The steam would be heated through a chemical process where high-strength hydrogen peroxide would suffer a decomposition triggered by a potassium permanganate catalyst. The highly oxygenated fumes produced by the reaction would then feed diesel combustion and allow a stable and high-capacity power output underwater. Walter even developed an early prototype named the V-80, which he would later present to Grand Admiral Erich Raeder on November 14, 1941. Karl Dönitz himself had urged the German High Command to concentrate on the development of Walter's research. He knew well before the conflict started that achieving such a milestone before France and Britain would guarantee naval superiority. However, as Germany overwhelmed all opposing forces during the Blitzkrieg, Hitler ordered the cancellation of all Wunderwaffe projects that could not be ready before 1941. He firmly believed that Germany would have won the war by then. The initial research into the next generation of submarines was thus halted, much to the frustration of Dönitz, who would constantly contend that the research was imperative for Germany. As imminent victory seemed to fade with every passing month, Dönitz revisited the issue of the Walter design. In a pressing letter, Dönitz urged Raeder to prioritize the, quote, immediate development, testing, and most rapid construction of the Walter U-boat. Alas, his pleas were ignored, and the wonder weapon design was shelved. However, as history would show, Dönitz was hardly an irresolute man. He left it upon himself to make sure the Walter submarine was developed, and during a naval conference in Berlin on September 28, 1942, he took the matter directly to Hitler. After a persuasive presentation, Hitler was convinced that the Walter submarine would play, quote, a decisive role in the outcome of this war. With the Führer's approval, expedited production of the Walter Type 21 U-boat finally began. The production advanced at extraordinary speeds. In October of 1942, Walter presented the Type 21 specifications, and a month later, he gave the basic model to Dönitz and other German commanding admirals. The groundbreaking vessel was designed to house 2 6,000-horsepower turbines and 2 colossal 2,000-horsepower diesel engines to achieve underwater speeds of over 18 knots. In addition, compared to the mere minutes previous U-boats could stay submerged, the Type 21 could traverse underwater for up to 75 hours without having to resurface. The submarine's capabilities also included safety from aircraft due to her underwater permanence, enough underwater speed to outrun most ships, an innovative hydraulic system to reload torpedoes automatically, and possible diving depths of up to 1,000 feet, placing the U-boat well beyond the reach of depth charges. With such incredible advantages, Dönitz was confident that Type 21's deployment would be a turning point for the war. Despite the enormous efforts during her deployment, Type 21 was delayed time and time again due to issues with the engine system. The setbacks were so significant that the model was partially reworked and delayed once more. When a new viable model was finally approved in 1943, the Naval High Command construction experts estimated that a fleet of submarines wouldn't be ready before 1946. Dönitz was livid. 1946 was too late, and the war would be lost if nothing changed. Reluctant to surrender his dream, Dönitz pulled on every string he could reach to accelerate the process. Nonetheless, Germany was by now running low on resources and men. Hitler drafted every single man he could into the conflict, and Dönitz's first task was to use his new influence on Hitler to convince him not to enlist shipyard workers. He then negotiated a deal to secure 30,000 tons of steel, a scarce resource by then. And finally, he partnered with the Armaments Ministry to conduct an unprecedented manufacturing program for the Type 21. Alas, despite all his persistent efforts, the best estimates put the deployments of the first units no sooner than late 1944 or early 1945. By now, the entire Nazi High Command was invested in the Type 21 project, so much so that an extraordinary decision was made. The conventional shipyard construction process would be utterly dismantled. In its place, they established an ambitious serialized component process. Following the novel procedure, the submarines would be manufactured as 8 separate cylindrical modules, each built and assembled inland by a subcontracted factory. The mass-produced segments would then be transported to designated assembly sites. The scheme worked, and the first units were finished by March of 1944. But as fate would have it, the process that made the delivery possible was also what doomed the project. Due to each model being hastily produced by a third-party company with little experience in shipbuilding, innumerable technical faults would arise when the time came for assembly. Of the 118 submarines manufactured, only 4 were combat-ready by 1945, when the war in Europe was already coming to an end. Ultimately, only 2 Type 21 U-boats were deployed into combat in early 1945. However, neither of them were destined to sink any ships. On May 4th, the chief officer of U-2511 claimed he had a British cruiser in his sights, but the news of the German ceasefire was received before he could fire. History ended for the Nazi Wunderwaffe, but the Type 21 continued to live on, this time in the hands of Allied forces, who assumed command of the vessels and used their designs to create an entirely new generation of submarines. Hence, Type 21 became the grandfather of all modern submarines, an unexpected inheritance from Nazi Germany and a peculiar twist of fate. However, some historians venture to suggest that if the earlier Type 21 project hadn't been halted, and if Germany had managed to deploy a fleet, the war could have unfolded very differently, giving the Nazis utter supremacy over the seas. Operation Regenbogen was launched at the end of World War II as a planned mass scuttling of all German submarines to avoid surrender. But U-977 escaped to Argentina and arrived in Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945. There was much speculation about the purpose of the long journey, with many people claiming that the submarine could have carried Hitler and high-ranking officials to the South American country. A full investigation was then launched, which gathered several testimonies from the captain and his crew to get to the bottom of the true story of those 66 crucial days. U-977 was a Type 7C U-boat from the Kriegsmarine fleet. Type 7 submarines were the most common U-boats during World War II, and the most produced in history, with 703. Type 7Cs were powered by 2 Germaniawerft F-46 4-stroke 6-cylinder supercharged diesel engines while on the surface, whereas 2 Brown Bavarian C GGUB 728 double-acting electric motors worked on submerged propulsion. In terms of armament, the submarines were equipped with a 3.7cm Flak-Zwilling M42U gun, the marine version of the 3.7cm Flak. It also carried 4 bows and 2 rear torpedo tubes. An effective fighting machine, it had a range of 8,500 nautical miles, which limited the time it could perform in the western and southern Atlantic without refueling. The Type 7Cs came into service towards the end of the first happy time, the first wave of U-boat victories against Allied navies near the beginning of the war. When the U-boat campaign was defeated in 1944, these submarines were still the majority in service. U-977 was perhaps the most well-known Type 7C submarine. It was launched in March of 1943 and had a displacement of 871 tons, with a complement of between 44 to 60 men. The U-boat was 67.1 meters long and 6.2 meters wide, with a speed of 17.7 knots at the surface and 7.6 knots when submerged. It was commissioned on May 6, 1943, at the Bloemenvos shipyard in Hamburg. The submarine was mostly used for training purposes at the beginning and was not part of any patrols during its first 2 years. It remained in the Baltic Sea until February of 1945, when it received its snorkel and went to combat training in Kristiansand, Norway. On May 2, 1945, at 10 p.m. local time, U-977 departed from Kristiansand on its way to its first war patrol mission. It was commanded by Oberleutnant Zorc Heinz Schaefer, who issued orders to sink any ships they encountered while crossing the English Channel through the British port of Southampton. However, as U-977 was outbound north of Scotland, it received orders from Admiral Duritz to stand down, cease combat activities, and navigate to deep waters to sink itself. These actions were part of Operation Regenbogen, and all German attack submarines needed to follow them to preserve the honor of the Kriegsmarine. More than 150 German submarines surrendered after May 5th. Given that some had to travel longer distances, the complete handover was not achieved until mid-May. Formal German surrender order was given on May 9th, when Admiral Duritz uttered, quote, "The continuation of the fight is impossible from the bases that we have left. Men of the submarines, without breaking your martial courage, you lay down your arms after a heroic fight without equal." 3 German submarines decided to escape rather than surrender to Europe or North America. U-1277 sank itself near Portugal in early June, and the crew was interned there. Meanwhile, U-530 crossed the Atlantic and arrived in Mar del Plata, Argentina on July 10th. Upon arrival in the middle of the night, they sent a message to the port authorities saying, quote, "German submarine." The surrender took the Argentines by surprise. Back at U-977, Lieutenant Schaefer discussed the matter with his crew and outlined several options. When he was interrogated later on, the captain said that the main reason they headed to Argentina was because of the propaganda broadcast by Joseph Goebbels, in which he claimed the Allied Morgenthau Plan would oppress Germany and enslave its people. They were also afraid of the precarious living conditions in which German prisoners of war lived and how they were forced into labor for reparations. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin alone had demanded 4 million German workers. The U-977 crew voted to head to Argentina, hoping to get better living conditions, as the country kept agreeable relations with Germany and had a significant local community. 30 men voted for Argentina, 2 for Spain, and 16 wished to return to their families. Those who did not want to continue were allowed to abandon the ship in life rafts and secretly disembarked on the Norwegian island of Holsnøy on May 10th. The rest of the crew then headed for South America. The submarine made a continuous snorkel passage and did not go further than northern Africa during the first 50 days of travel. Meanwhile, the conditions on board were quickly deteriorating. On July 14th, the submarine reached Cape Verde and stopped for a break. Their 66-day journey had become the second longest snorkel patrol, but when later interrogated, the crew did not mention such a long submerged voyage. A report by the U.S. Navy stated that U-977 dove twice, first on sighting a plane and a second time when coming across a ship. The report indicated that the submarine, quote, was also DF'd many times late in May. Due to translation and miscommunication issues, this could mean traversing in snorkel depth and then diving on contact. The U.S. Navy did report that the submarine stopped on the Cape Verde Islands. The skipper later testified that they made the rest of the trip from Africa to Mar del Plata, alternating between surface and submerged sailing. Finally, U-977 arrived in Mar del Plata in mid-August, 108 days after departing from Norway. The German crew discussed that they should scuttle the submarine somewhere before approaching the coast, and then swim to shore clandestinely, but the feat would have entailed remarkable seamanship. The crew surrendered at 11 a.m. on August 17th. Lieutenant Hector Migone had spotted the incoming ship and alerted the authorities. The Germans were interned for a while and then became so-called prisoners of war, even though the war was already over. The men were extradited to the U.S., where they faced charges of having sunk the Brazilian cruiser Bahia. However, the astute commander had kept the full complement of torpedoes to avoid such accusations after the ceasefire. After the U.S., the crew was sent to the United Kingdom, where they faced accusations of carrying Nazi leaders to Argentina before surrendering. Schaefer contended that it was impossible to approach the coast before arriving at Mar del Plata. He said, quote, "Nobody had the opportunity to disembark secretly during the night. The distance was too great. Some crew members hovered with the idea of escaping if they arrived at night. How could we show that, apart from the crew members, certain wanted characters did not go ashore?" The crew was released in 1946, but the captain was retained, quote, I was led before a group of high Anglo-American officers who made up an investigative commission specially sent to Argentina to clarify the mysterious case of U-977. Meanwhile, U-977 itself was seized by the U.S. Navy and sunk during a firing exercise in 1946. The fact that 2 submarines had managed to arrive in Argentina undetected by the Allies pointed to vulnerable weaknesses, and rumors started to spread immediately after the arrival of U-530. In July of 1945, Ladislav Szabo, an immigrant Hungarian journalist, published a theory in the newspaper Kritika speculating that Hitler could be in Argentina, and stories about a secret Nazi base beyond Patagonia in the South Pole also circulated. The arrival of a second submarine only ignited the fuel. In 1945, British newspaper Star published that, quote, "Doubts were always expressed about Hitler's fate, and many people are reluctant to believe the information about his death." Both American and British authorities extensively interrogated Schaefer, accusing him of hiding the Fuhrer and bringing him to Argentina. Schaefer recalled that, quote, "As I could no longer tell them anything more than what I had already declared to the Argentines, they became impatient as my submarine trip continued to elicit lively comments and big headlines." Schaefer was eventually released in 1947 and went back to Argentina, where he got married and wrote the book U-977, 66 Days Underwater. It was published in 1952 and was the first post-war memoir written by a U-boat officer. There was also speculation that the submarines were carrying precious stones, jewels, or even valuable art pieces that the Nazis had stolen from the best museums in Europe. The rumors eventually went away as authorities looked into the U-977 log and calculated the time and distance it traveled. To this day, there are those who still believe that the submarines did carry high-ranking Nazi officials, as many were tracked down to South America after the war. The pocket battleship Lutzow and her crew were in the middle of an intense combat scenario. In typical German naval fashion, their surprise attack on convoy JW-51B had gone wrong, and the Kriegsmarine was outmanned, outgunned, and outnumbered. Still, true to their combat mentality, Lutzow and the rest of the German ships engaged the British with everything they had. Lutzow kept firing her 28-centimeter guns at point-blank range under heavy fog that severely limited visibility. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that there would be no victor if these reckless encounters continued. One side had to bail out. It was either the British or the Germans. Or maybe both. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was forbidden from having a proper army, air force, and navy. Still, by the 1920s, the Washington Naval Treaty and its severe limitations finally allowed Germany to get rid of its few pre-dreadnought ships and begin developing new vessels that did not exceed 10,000 tons. Although the victors could still build vessels of up to 35,000 tons, the Germans and the Reichsmarine were not willing to let anyone intimidate them. German officers soon began working on an ambitious warship design that would allow the Reichsmarine to develop powerful vessels that would not break the naval treaty. Their preliminary studies had one objective: to come up with a surface vessel that could be light enough to not exceed the tonnage limit of the 1922 naval treaty, but also armed to the teeth to destroy enemy warships that were heavier and larger. After meticulous designs and negotiations with Britain, France, and the US, the Germans finally came up with their Deutschland-class warship in 1928. This class was classified as a Panzerschiffe, or armored cruiser, by the Reichsmarine, and 3 vessels were built. Their weight and dimensions varied, according to several modifications to improve the design. Still, their purpose would remain the same: to outgun any hostile ship fast enough to approach them, or stay away from it if outgunned. The lead ship of the Deutschland-class cruisers, or Panzerschiffs, was 186 meters long. Deutschland had a beam of 20.7 meters, a maximum draft of 7.25 meters, and a displacement of almost 16,200 tons under full load. More importantly, it was officially stated that the vessel fell within the limits of the Treaty of Versailles and the Washington Naval Treaty. The ship was powered by 8 MAN 9-cylinder diesel engines that delivered over 56,000 sea horsepower to 2 shafts, translating into a top speed of 52 kilometers per hour. She could steam for almost 20,000 kilometers at a cruising speed of 37 kilometers per hour, and her maximum range at lower speeds could reach up to 16,500 kilometers. Before the war broke out between France and the United Kingdom, the ship had a crew of 586 sailors and 33 officers. But as the war approached, it was increased to 1,040 servicemen. Deutschland's armored belt was 60 to 80 millimeters thick, while her main deck went from 17 to 45, and her upper deck measured 17 millimeters. In addition, the front of the main guns was 140 millimeters thick, while their sides were 80. Deutschland was also equipped with 2 Arado AR-196 seaplanes and 1 catapult to launch them. These reconnaissance low-wing monoplanes were used by the ship's crew for reconnaissance missions and attacking small vessels, and they were armed with 1 MG-81 machine gun and 2 20mm MG FFM cannons that could carry 2 50-kilogram bombs. Moreover, the Panzerschiff also carried a pair of quadruple deck-mounted torpedo tubes on her stern. Deutschland's primary armament comprised 6 28cm SKC-28 guns mounted in 2 triple-gun turrets on the ship's superstructure. The arrangement was standard. 1 gun turret was located forward and the other one aft. These powerful guns, designed in 1928, had a weight of over 47 tons and a barrel length of almost 14 meters. The SKC-28 gun had an approximate muzzle velocity of 910 meters per second and a maximum firing range of 36,475 meters. Muzzle velocity and range varied according to the angle at which the gun was fired and the type of shell used, such as armor-piercing, semi-armor-piercing, and igniting shells. Still, the 28cm gun was a powerful adversary at sea, especially when fitted with a fast and agile vessel such as the pocket battleship. Secondary armament comprised 8 15cm SKC-28 guns mounted in single turrets located amidships. Such guns were also mounted on the Scharnhorst-class, Bismarck-class, and Graf Zeppelin-class ships. The guns, designed by Rheinmetall in the early 1930s, had a weight of 20,000 pounds and a barrel length of 7.8 meters, with a muzzle velocity of over 875 meters per second and a maximum range of 23,000 meters. Surplus SKC-28 guns were also used as coast defense guns by the Heer during the war, and some were even used during the post-war until the end of the Cold War. Initially, Deutschland was equipped with 3 8.8cm L-45 anti-aircraft guns, but she was then upgraded with 6 8.8cm L-78 or C-31 guns. These guns had a superior range of over 17,000 meters and a muzzle velocity of 1,060 meters per second, and could effectively fire high explosive and illumination rounds with tracer ammunition. However, because of their short barrel life expectancy of little more than 1,500 full charges, they were replaced by 10 2cm, 6 10.5cm L-65, and 4 3.7cm anti-aircraft guns. Deutschland was ordered by the Reichsmarine from the Deutsche Werk shipyard in Kiel in February of 1929, and she was launched 2 years later. The first of the 3 pocket battleships was christened by German President von Hindenburg and Chancellor Heinrich Brüning. It is said that during her launching, Deutschland began sliding down the slipway while the Chancellor was addressing the public, creating an awkward moment for all. Sea trials began in 1932, and after a successful series of tests, Deutschland was commissioned in April of 1933. She completed more tests during the following year and visited numerous foreign ports in Europe. When the crew returned in April of 1934, they were surprised by Adolf Hitler himself, who decided to tour the ship and spend some time with the sailors. During the following months, Deutschland made several visits to ports across the Atlantic, going to the Caribbean and several South American countries. Afterward, the ship returned to Germany for maintenance and got her aircraft catapult installed. In early 1936, she joined her sister ship, Admiral Scheer, to visit Madeira and the Atlantic, but this voyage was interrupted by the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. In July, the 2 pocket battleships were deployed to the Spanish coasts to conduct non-intervention patrols and prevent Soviet and British forces from supplying the Republicans with weapons and other armaments. Germany had decided to support Francisco Franco and the Nationalists, and began to help them with intelligence and supplies. As such, Deutschland was attacked by Republican aircraft in May of 1937, while she was moored at Ibiza. Although the ship's anti-aircraft fire drove the hostile aircraft away, 2 Soviet SB-2 bombers were able to drop 2 bombs on top of her. One bomb hit one of her starboard guns, leading to relentless fires that cost several lives, while the second bomb hit the deck near the bridge and exploded above the armored deck, wounding dozens of men. While Deutschland returned to Germany to be repaired and bury the fallen sailors, Admiral Scheer avenged and bombed the port of Almeria. Deutschland left Wilhelmshaven 1 week before the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939 and made way for Greenland to attack merchant vessels. The crew was ordered to follow prize rules, which meant that Deutschland had to stop merchant ships, inspect them, take in their crew, and then sink the vessels once everyone was safe. Her first prey was the British transport ship Stonegate, which sank on October 5, 1939. The ship then encountered the American ship City of Flint, which was taken to Norway for additional inspection on October 9th. The third prey came on October 14th, and the pocket battleship sank the Norwegian transport Lawrence W. Hansen. Then, as British and French ships began to track her down, Deutschland was called to the Denmark Strait, where she was anchored at Gottenhafen and overhauled. The Fuhrer then decided it would be a good idea to rename the ship. Hitler and his top officials realized that it would be demoralizing if a ship bearing the name of the fatherland was lost at the hands of the enemy. Consequently, Panzerschiff Deutschland was renamed Lützow after the renowned Prussian Lieutenant General Adolf von Lützow. Moreover, Admiral Erich Raeder hoped that changing the ship's name would confuse the Allied forces with the Admiral Hipper-class cruiser Lützow. The renewed pocket battleship immediately joined Group 5 of Konteradmiral Oskar Kummetz, tasked with capturing Oslo as part of Operation Weserübung. However, Lützow's group was attacked by Norwegian coastal batteries while she was carrying over 400 soldiers. The ship was severely damaged by 15-centimeter rounds, forcing her to withdraw from the fjord after firing her few working guns. Lützow then sailed to Germany for repairs and was recommissioned in March of 1941. Shortly after her recommission, Lützow left port and was attacked by British torpedo bombers near Egersund on June 12, 1942, forcing her to return. It wasn't until May of 1942 that she was commissioned again after being dispatched to Bagan Bay. She then became the flagship of Vice Admiral Kummetz and part of Operation Russelsprung, whose objective was to destroy the Allied convoy PQ-17. This group comprised 35 transport ships that were bound for the Soviet Union. On July 3rd, Kummetz's task force left Norway to intercept the enemy convoy, but heavy fog significantly limited operations. Lützow then ran aground with other ships, suffering substantial damage without ever making contact with the enemy. Still, the Luftwaffe and U-boats successfully destroyed 24 of the 35 hostile vessels after Kummetz's force retreated. By December of 1942, she was back just in time for Operation Regenbogen, a crucial Arctic Ocean sortie to get rid of Allied convoy JW-51B. Kummetz split his forces for this operation, but was overwhelmed by the enemy during the Battle of the Barents Sea. The British cruisers outnumbered and outgunned the Germans, forcing them to turn tail before getting sunk, but not without a fight. During the operation, Lützow steamed directly into the enemy convoy, while other ships lured the escort away from the merchant vessels. Despite the limited visibility and the harsh weather conditions, Lützow opened fire for over 20 minutes, but failed to score any hits. Lützow then steamed to support Admiral Hipper as she was being surrounded by HMS Jamaica and Sheffield. Soon, She engaged both ships, but neither was damaged. Unable to harm the enemy, and fearful of being outnumbered, Kamitz withdrew to avoid any losses. Hitler was furious and ordered all Kriegsmarine ships to be grounded. As such, Lützow was transferred to Altafjord and then to Kiel. Then, on April 13, 1945, over 20 Royal Air Force Lancasters attacked Lützow and Prince Eugen near the Plost Canal in the Baltic. A second attack damaged Lützow with one tallboy bomb. The ship began sinking at the canal, but her main deck remained 2 meters above the water. This allowed the crew to use some guns to fend off enemy attacks. Lützow repelled wave after wave of hostile forces until she ran out of ammunition 1 month later. The crew then decided to scuttle the ship before Soviet forces approached and seized her. Unfortunately, the Soviets managed to raise the vessel and took it to the Soviet Union for inspection, where she was finally sunk during a weapons test in July of 1947 near Świnoujście, Poland, ending a fruitful career as a stalwart of the German forces. The 20th century was just beginning, and the Russian Empire was making significant upgrades to its navy. Towards the end of 1911, they built a vessel unlike most at the time, a salvage ship that would rescue submarines from the ocean's depths. Based on the German SMS Vulcan, the Russian engineers created a ship whose lengthy and fruitful career no one could have foreseen. In 1915, Kommuna began her service with the Russian Empire. She then became part of the Soviet Navy and continued her service with the Russian Federation over a century after her commission. From the biting waters of the Baltic during the siege of Leningrad to modern-day rescue operations in the Atlantic, Kommuna is the oldest ship in service with the Russian Navy, but that hasn't stopped her from carrying out some of the most challenging assignments in the Black Sea, including the secretive recovery of highly delicate materials from the sunken guided missile cruiser Moskva. Kommuna, the first Russian double-hull vessel, was conceived early in the 20th century. Ordered by the Navy General Staff, the ship was based on the innovative German SMS Vulcan. On December 30th, 1911, the Putilov Company received an order from the General Directorate of Shipbuilding, officially winning the contract. 5 months later, the parts signed the construction contract. The ship was laid down at the Putilov factory, now the Kirov factory in St. Petersburg, towards the end of 1912. She was named Volkov and launched within a year, though she was not commissioned until July of 1915. Volkov's unique-looking design took heavily from her German inspiration, but compared to Vulcan, the Russian version was longer and had a considerably greater displacement and a more extensive rig. Also, she had 2 lifting frames between her catamaran hulls to pull robust objects from the seabed and into her bay. And her double-hull construction provided enough space for docking submarines and diverse salvaged objects. Both ends were joined, thus creating a moon pool. Volkov could carry 10 spare torpedoes and 50 tons of fuel, and she housed accommodation for 60 submariners. In 1915, the vessel finally entered active service and acted as a submarine tender and salvage ship with the Baltic Fleet. Volkov's first successful salvage of a submarine happened in mid-1917 when she raised the sunken Holland-class AG-15 off a land. Later that year, she also refloated the Bars-class Adinerog from a depth of 13.5 meters. Notably, she would service British E and C-class submarines on top of Russian models. Volkov continued rescuing sunken boats and operating as a submarine tender in between assignments with the Russian Navy until the Communist uprising of 1917. The salvage ship then participated with the Soviet Baltic Fleet in the Civil War and was redesignated days after the founding of the USSR in 1922. It was then that she officially received the name of Kommuna, meaning commune, a more appropriate title for the nation's drastically changed political outlook. The ship would carry that name for the remainder of her extensive career. Komuna continued to serve in the Baltic, and she once extinguished a fire aboard the Zmaya submarine. She also raised the dispatch boat Kubchik and the Krasnoarmeyets. In the late 1920s, Komuna raised the British submarine HMS L-55 from a depth of 62 meters. She had been sunk in the Gulf of Finland the year before, and would later become a prototype for the Leninets class. Komuna also tended submarines early in her service life. Other than recovery missions, her tasks included repair work and refueling, as well as swapping the ship's crews. Needless to say, she came to the aid of many sorts of ships, including a tug and torpedo boat, and she would also be deployed to salvage aircraft later in her career. Still, perhaps her most notorious role came in 1941, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Based at Leningrad, formerly St. Petersburg, Komuna faced the relentless bulk of the Nazi assault during the siege. Despite being bombed and damaged during the German invasion, the salvage ship dutifully continued her service. At the time, the city's only supply route was known as the Road of Life, and it was a treacherous path. Komuna helped recover valuable tanks and vehicles that had fallen through the ice. In March of 1942, Komuna retrieved 4 KV tanks, 2 tractors, and 31 vehicles from Lake Ladoga, and the vessel repaired 6 M-class submarines and salvaged many other ships before the end of the year. The crew was then sent to the Volga River, where they recovered the tug Ivan and an Ilyushin IL-2 aircraft. For her invaluable role in salvaging such precious vehicles from sunken supply ships during the harrowing campaign, Komuna and her crew were awarded the Medal for the Defense of Leningrad. Still, they were nowhere near done. In 1944, the vessel recovered a total of 11,767 tons from 14 wrecks and also repaired 34 ships. And after the war, the ship continued her service until a due refitting in 1954, where she received more modern Dutch engines to replace her obsolete machinery. While Komuna's double-hull construction was intended to provide space for docking and an assortment of salvaged vessels and objects, she was upgraded many times over the years. Moreover, submarines grew significantly in size in the post-war era and the Cold War, so her central area was repurposed. Komuna then continued her service through the end of the 1950s, successfully locating the submarine M200 and raising the M256. However, she needed a proper enhancement a decade later if she wanted to remain in service. The salvage ship eventually sailed from the Baltic to the Black Sea in 1967, and her central area was refitted to house compact recovery submarines, smaller remote-controlled submersibles, and parts of collected wreckage, a transformation that cost 11 million rubles. However, the time and resources invested in these improvements would handsomely pay off past the turn of the century. Komuna was later refurbished to serve as a Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle, or DSRV, mothership. The ship received a first-generation 45-ton Project 1837 submersible boat, capable of diving to 500 meters and rescuing no less than 20 submariners at a time. Equipped with a Type AS-6 Poisk 2 submersible, Komuna then broke a record in December of 1974 while diving to a depth of 2,026 meters. The ship was so effective that 3 years later, she was deployed to search for a Sukhoi Su-24 aircraft that crashed off the Caucasus and sank to 1,700 meters. Then, in 1984, Komuna was to be transferred to the Russian Academy of Sciences, but the initiative was cancelled. Afterward, the ship was intensely looted and required a complete overhaul before re-entering naval service. It wasn't until the summer of 1999 that Komuna received another redesignation, categorizing her as a rescue ship instead of a salvage ship. But as time went by, the Project 1837 submersibles were retired, and Komuna was equipped with the Project 1855 Priest-class DSRV AS-28, which she has to this day. The new submersible proved to have similar performance, with the notable exception being its ability to dive twice as deep. Furthermore, the boat features 2 manipulator arms that enable it to execute several tasks on the sea floor. ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles, can also be hosted and operated from the ship. After the turn of the millennium, the new centenary vessel was equipped with a British Pantera Plus rescue submarine, with a range of operation of up to 1,000 meters. And as of 2012, she was in service with the detachment of rescue vessels based at Sevastopol. Casual observers often overlook naval auxiliaries. However, in times of war, they rise to the spotlight whenever they're needed. As independent analyst H.I. Sutton expressed, quote, "Among them, salvage ships are so obscure that they are often forgotten in popular fleet lists." When the guided missile cruiser Moskva was sunk in April of 2022 while being towed back to port on the Crimean coast, Komuna was quick to answer. While there are no official reports on what precisely the vessel was carrying, sensitive materials and classified items, weapons, and communication systems are a high priority for immediate recovery efforts. Indeed, her sinking is considered the most prominent naval loss during combat in decades. Sutton reckons that it is likely any salvage attempt will involve the veteran ship, whose modern hardware would easily reach the wreckage. However, Moskva was sunk in one piece, and her size makes her recovery highly impractical. In the meantime, Komuna will assist in retrieving important materials that foreign powers might target. Also, given her proximity to the wreckage site, Komuna might be an ideal choice to surveil the area. Throughout her career, the rescue ship has raised over 150 vessels, among submarines and other types, but the 110-year-old ship is far from obsolete. Despite the numerous enhancements she's undergone throughout the years, her basic structure remains virtually unchanged. And she continues to serve while having been operated by the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and the modern Russian Federation. In fact, the rescue ship is currently the oldest vessel in active service with the Russian Navy, and as Sutton wrote, quote, "Whether you see her as an elegant old lady or an out-of-date accident waiting to happen, she is certainly one of the more interesting ships afloat today." Few NATO intelligence analysts could peek into the Iron Curtain and live to tell the tale. Nevertheless, CIA operatives continuously spied on the latest Soviet developments and shared their findings with the Pentagon. In mid-1969, a team of operatives made a unique discovery while passing through the Neva River. They spotted a small, modern submarine tied up at Leningrad's old Sudamek submarine shipyard. The submarine was over 79 meters in length and had a unique, streamlined hull that featured a peculiar attribute. It was highly reflective. As the days went by, the CIA concluded that the Soviets had achieved the unthinkable. They had developed the world's smallest submarine, made entirely of titanium, making it lighter and 3 times stronger than conventional steel submarines. The analysts knew that taking down the Soviets' titanium submarine at sea would be no easy feat. No U.S. torpedo possessed the necessary capacity or speed to destroy it. Unfortunately, they were right. The Soviet Navy had humble beginnings after the Russian Civil War. During World War II, it merely served as a coastal defense force against the powerful Kriegsmarine warships and U-boat fleets. Nevertheless, it quickly expanded once the war ended and the borders were drawn between the Western powers and the vast Soviet Union. The power of the atom led to the American development of nuclear-powered submarines. The Soviet Navy struggled to catch up with the U.S., but it quickly grew into a formidable blue-water navy and became the second most powerful in the world. Although the Soviets did not follow the U.S. Navy's practice of building submarines by incorporating cutting-edge technologies in large production models, they made them up in large numbers. In the late 1950s, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the country's Council of Ministers issued several directives for developing several high-speed submarine designs with time-tested capabilities. Some of these designs were Project 661, or the Papa-class submarine, and Project 651 and 659, purpose-built, conventionally powered guided missile submarines, designated Juliet and Echo by NATO. Another was Project 705, which was the designation for the development of a 1,500-ton interceptor submarine capable of speeds of at least 40 knots to attack American aircraft carriers. Project 705 Lyra envisioned two objectives the Soviet Union pursued. First, the Soviet Navy sought a design that could turn the tide of naval warfare in the Arctic and North Atlantic against the United States and its allies. Secondly, the USSR wanted to push technological development forward to develop new assets that could be employed in the future for the more powerful underwater craft. Besides the challenging technical capabilities of the new submarine, the Soviets also sought to employ titanium alloy for the design to reduce the weight and thickness of the hull. Additionally, titanium would provide a stronger internal and external hull with higher corrosion resistance. The result would be a small, versatile, and fast submarine design never seen before. But it was not going to be easy. Working with titanium was new for Soviet engineers. Previous designs used steel and aluminum, which were easier to work with. Producing large titanium alloy components would require new manufacturing processes that would take years to develop. M.G. Rusunov proposed a design in late 1957. Work began in 1960 in Leningrad after the SKB-143 Design Bureau was assigned to the project. Several specialists were consulted about the project's feasibility, and due to its innovative objectives and requirements, they decided to greenlight it. The submarine design was revisited several times to make it achievable. In 1963, the displacement was increased from 1,500 to 2,300 tons, doubling the number of internal compartments to 6 and allowing a maximum crew of 29. Besides the speed capabilities that called for a lighter design and minimal displacement, new requirements were also issued and added, such as a reduced crew and low detectability. Production of Project 705 officially began in 1964 at Leningrad. The lead boat of the class was K-64 and was commissioned in 1971. During these years, undercover American intelligence agents closely followed the Soviet development of the program. In late 1969, agents walking along the Neva River first noticed a new vessel in the Sudamek submarine shipyard in Leningrad. Senior submarine analyst Herb Lord soon realized the Soviets were building a nuclear-powered attack submarine with new features. CIA operatives and engineers estimated its length to be about 80 meters, a surface displacement of around 2,600 tons, and a submerged displacement of roughly 3,700 tons. The agents also noted the submarine had a unique-looking streamlined hull form and a high reserve buoyancy of around 30%, which greatly contrasted with the average 8 to 11% of U.S. Navy submarines. If that was not enough, it was the world's smallest nuclear submarine ever developed. There was no doubt it was a new Soviet submarine. It quickly received the NATO classification Alpha Class SSN. During the next months, CIA operatives continued to analyze the Alpha Class submarine. The analysts noticed the use of a highly reflective pressure hull. After gathering additional intelligence, naval designers and engineers concluded the Soviets had employed titanium alloy to build it. The Alpha submarine, or Project 705, comprised a double hull made entirely of titanium. Like in most Soviet submarines of the era, the internal hull was meant to withstand the pressure. At the same time, the outer portion protected it and gave the submarine its hydrodynamic shape. Titanium was stronger and 33% lighter than steel. Consequently, the pressure hull was tougher without increasing displacement. This improved hull provided greater diving depth and resistance to explosives at lesser depths. Furthermore, the titanium hull was effectively non-magnetic, greatly decreasing the probability of magnetic anomaly detection. The one drawback Soviet engineers faced was that titanium was 3 times costlier than steel. The pressure hull was split into 6 watertight compartments, of which only the third was manned. The rest were fully automated and only required maintenance and supervision from the 16 to 20-man crew. This was a significant reduction from the usual 160 men required to man a nuclear submarine. One of the benefits of the high level of automation was the reduced crew size, which besides reducing manpower, helped with orders due to the shorter chain of command. This could help the crew perform better under combat situations, as communication between crewmen would be more direct. Additionally, automation would help the crew focus on the more important tasks and operate most of the vessel's systems from the control room. This would leave mundane tasks to the machinery and reduce crew fatigue and boredom. Lastly, automation was also expected to greatly reduce the demand for electric power. Another key feature of the Alpha submarine was the use of liquid metal reactor coolants, which resulted in optimal horsepower to the weight-volume ratio for increased speeds. An Accord, or Combat Information and Control System, which processed radar, navigation, television, and hydroacoustic data from other systems to determine the precise location and speeds of submarines, ships, and torpedoes, was also an innovation used in the Alpha. The Sargon weapon control system controlled torpedo homing and countermeasures. In contrast, the Okean automated hydroacoustic system provided target data and eliminated the need for crewmen to work with detection equipment. The Alpha submarine could reach a depth of little more than 400 meters with relative ease. It could reach speeds of up to 40 knots while submerged, carrying a mix of mines, SSN-15 cruise missiles, and SET-65 and SAET-60 torpedoes. 6 Alpha submarines were produced by the Soviet Navy, but none of them ever saw combat. NATO and the US reacted by launching the development of 2 of the world's most powerful torpedoes, the Mark 48 and the Spearfish. Despite closely following the project's developments, the US Navy did not attempt to match the Alpha-class submarine. Titanium was exceptionally strong and resistant, there was no doubt about that. Nevertheless, the metal was not just difficult to work with, but expensive. This material was rarer than steel and iron, making a submarine costlier than a conventional design employing other metals. While titanium was easier to come by in Russia, considered to be a major supplier, using it in the United States would have been costlier and more complicated. The construction of the legendary SR-71 Blackbird involved the secret import of titanium from the Soviet Union during the early 1960s. The US was not willing to go through a similar process. In 1971, the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA published an analysis titled Use of Titanium by the Soviet Shipbuilding Industry, which concluded the Soviets had indeed developed the capability to shape and weld heavy titanium plates. However, some top-tier American officers refused to believe the intel because shaping and welding heavy titanium hull sections was more difficult than small parts employed for aircraft or missiles. While these parts could be welded in small, hermetically sealed chambers, it was deemed impractical for submarine pieces. Titanium could not be welded in exposed air. It had to be shielded by argon gas in special chambers. However, doing so with huge submarine pressure hull sections was considered impossible. Consequently, the US ditched the idea and instead invested in countermeasures to destroy the Alpha-class submarines. Such were the advances achieved by Project 705 and the challenges that its features posed for Western powers. Although the Alphas were decommissioned and scrapped by 1996, the technology employed proved viable for future designs, such as the Akula-class submarines and other vessels. When Japan finally surrendered at the end of World War II, the US Navy made a significant discovery: 24 submarines, some of which boasted remarkable technology. These submarines were taken to Sasebo Bay for study. However, the situation took a concerning turn when the US military received a warning. The Soviets were intent on acquiring the sophisticated innovations on board these vessels. Faced with this threat, the US Navy devised a plan called Operation Road's End. It decided to take most of the submarines to a remote location, known as Point Deep 6, well out of the Soviets' reach. There, the submarines were loaded with special explosive charges and sent where the new enemies couldn't access them. Nonetheless, 4 of these submarines escaped their sister's fate and were instead taken to Hawaii for further inspection. Among these, 2 stood out as extraordinary examples of a unique kind of vessel, the I-400 class submarine carriers. In the early 20th century, several countries set out to create submarine aircraft carriers. The idea was to bring seaplanes closer to the action, allowing pilots to gather information about enemy ships without the need for a land base. Germany took the first steps during World War I, modifying seaplanes to carry bombs. In December 1915, one example successfully flew across the English Channel, dropping bombs near London. However, the aircraft had limited range. Inspired by this success, the Germans developed a plan to launch seaplanes from submerged submarines to increase their range. As early as January 1915, U-12 achieved a successful launch of a seaplane off its deck in Zeebrugge. The seaplane was secured on the submarine's deck, carried for 30 miles, and then released to float off. The plane took off, flew undetected along the British coast, and returned to Zeebrugge. Despite this achievement, further improvements were necessary. While Germany's plans were ultimately rejected by the Naval Command, the British and the United States also experimented with aircraft-carrying submarines. The British modified HMS E-22 to launch seaplanes, but they were exposed on the deck and couldn't be launched if the submarine submerged. The United States purchased seaplanes from Germany for evaluation and conducted tests aboard the S-1 submarine. However, difficulties in launching and recovering the aircraft, along with their limited military value, led to a loss of interest in the concept. In contrast, the French submarine Surcouf and the Italian submarine Ettore Fieramosca were equipped with hangars for reconnaissance seaplanes. Surcouf, designed as an underwater cruiser, had a hangar, torpedo tubes, and a twin-gun turret. Ettore Fieramosca had a waterproof hangar, and suitable aircraft were ordered. However, the program was ultimately cancelled, and the hangar was removed before the submarine's delivery. Due to the constraints imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty and the loss of HMS M1 in 1925, the Royal Navy faced challenges. In consequence, they were compelled to repurpose their remaining M-class submarines. Among them was the M2, which underwent a remarkable transformation. She was retrofitted with a watertight hangar that housed a small seaplane known as the Parnell Peto. Then, in October 1928, a hydraulic catapult was installed on the M2, enabling the seaplane to be launched from a ramp on the submarine's forward casing. Consequently, the submarine and her aircraft could carry out reconnaissance missions ahead of the fleet, diving underwater to evade potential threats. Equipped with folding wings, the seaplane would be catapulted off the deck runway, and upon completing its mission, would be hoisted back on board using a specially designed crane. The crew of the M2 took great pride in their ability to swiftly launch the seaplane and constantly aimed to improve their speed record. Sadly, their desire for speed ultimately led to their demise. During exercises off Portland on January 26, 1932, the M2 submerged at 10:11 a.m. and never resurfaced. On January 29th, the Hope was officially abandoned for the 60 crew members aboard. After 8 days of searching, divers made a tragic discovery. The hangar door was open, with the seaplane still inside, suggesting it had been opened while the submarine was submerged. Attempts were made to salvage the plane, but despite the involvement of 26 Royal Navy divers conducting 1,500 dives over 11 months, the Admiralty eventually admitted defeat. On December 8, 1932, the M2 was left to rest permanently on the seabed off Portland, marking the end of the Royal Navy's experiment with aircraft-launching submarines. By the late 1930s, the Kriegsmarine embarked on an endeavor that led to the order of 4 cruiser U-boats in 1939, which were twice the size of any existing U-boat at the time. These submarines were designed to accommodate a single Arado AR-231 floatplane. Yet, the outbreak of war canceled the ambitious project. Nevertheless, certain U-boats were equipped with a unique aircraft called the Fokker Achilles FA-330. This rotary-wing kite, also known as a gyroglider or rotor kite, was particularly used in the long-range U-boat Type 9D2 Monson employed by the Germans. The Germans had also intended to utilize another aircraft, the Flettner FL-282A Colibri, a compact helicopter designed for a single pilot. However, the FL-282 Colibri was never actually deployed on a German submarine. In contrast, the concept was extensively employed by the Japanese, with a total of 47 submarines capable of carrying seaplanes, the most common variant being Type B. Notable examples include submarines like I-15 and I-17, which boasted impressive speed and range. These submarines featured a hangar in front of the conning tower to house a Yokosuka E-14Y seaplane. The effectiveness of the Japanese aircraft-carrying submarines was demonstrated in various engagements. For instance, in 1942, the USS Saratoga aircraft carrier was damaged by I-26, while I-19 successfully struck USS Wasp with torpedoes, causing severe damage to the vessel and other nearby ships. Also, in an extraordinary event in September 1942, I-25 carried out the only aerial bombings on the United States, dropping incendiary bombs near Brookings, Oregon. Another notable type of submarine was the AM submarine, which was larger and could accommodate 2 seaplanes. Although they possessed impressive range and speed, their underwater performance was compromised, rendering them vulnerable to attacks. USS Lawrence C. Taylor, an aircraft from USS Anzio, sank the I-13 in July 1945, while the I-14 surrendered at sea and was later scrapped after the war. But that would not be the case with the Sentoku type. The Sentoku type, or I-400 class submarines, held the title of the largest submarines ever built until the 1960s, when nuclear ballistic missile submarines emerged. Designed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, these submarines were intended to form a fleet of 18 examples, but ultimately only 3 were constructed: I-400, I-401, and I-402. These immense submarines displaced 6,500 tons and stretched over 400 feet in length, 3 times the size of regular submarines. Their unique figure-8 hull design provided added strength to support an on-deck hangar. The primary strategy of the I-400 class submarines was to surface, launch their planes, and swiftly submerge again to avoid detection. Despite this tactic, they were equipped with 3 anti-aircraft guns, a large deck gun, and 8 torpedo tubes, capable of firing the infamous long-lance torpedoes. In addition, they featured radar, periscopes, demagnetization cables, and an anechoic coating to minimize detection by enemy forces. Each submarine had the capacity to carry 3 specially designed Seiran aircraft. The Aichi M6A, armed with a 1,760-pound bomb load, could travel 650 miles at a speed of 360 miles per hour. The aircraft's wings, horizontal stabilizers, and top of the vertical stabilizer were foldable to fit in the hangar, reducing the overall profile. With a crew of 4, the submarines could prepare and launch all 3 aircraft within 45 minutes using a 120-foot catapult on the foredeck. While most Japanese submarine aircraft carriers could only accommodate 1 or 2 aircraft, the I-400 class submarines boasted an impressive capacity to carry 3. Powered by 4 3,000 horsepower engines, these submarines could carry enough fuel to circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times, granting them the extraordinary range to go anywhere in the world and back, not to mention to reach the United States from either direction. As the Japanese faced mounting setbacks, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, devised a daring plan to strike key American cities, including New York and Washington, D.C. To achieve this audacious objective, Captain Chikao Yamamoto and Commander Yasuo Fujimori proposed employing a secret submarine attack called Sentoku to disable the locks of the Panama Canal. By severing American supply lines to the Pacific Ocean and disrupting the transfer of U.S. ships, the Japanese hoped to gain a significant strategic advantage. Initially, the Japanese acknowledged the presence of American fortifications guarding the canal on both sides. However, as the war progressed and Japan's prospects dimmed, security around the canal gradually weakened. Intelligence gathering and interviews with American prisoners of war revealed that defensive measures had been compromised, making the feasibility of the plan more apparent. Executing the attack required a team of Japanese engineers to meticulously study blueprints and documents obtained from a former canal construction worker. Through their analysis, they identified the vulnerability of the Miraflores locks on the Pacific side to aerial bombing. However, they concluded that targeting the Gatun locks on the Atlantic side would inflict more substantial damage. The engineers estimated that a successful attack on the locks would render the canal unusable for at least 6 months. Commander Fujimori requested modifications to 2 fleet submarines, I-13 and I-14, to facilitate the operation, enabling them to carry additional Seiran aircraft. This increased the number of available planes to a total of 10. The plan involved launching the Seirans from the submarines off the coast of Ecuador, flying at high altitudes across Colombia, and ultimately approaching the canal locks at dawn. After completing their bombing runs, the Seirans would return to rendezvous with the submarines for retrieval. By April 1945, a pivotal decision was made. The Seiran pilots would employ kamikaze tactics, sacrificing themselves by ramming the gates of the canal instead of conventional bombing. Training and preparations ensued, including the construction of a wooden model of the Gatun Locks Gate for practice sessions. By June, all 4 aircraft-carrying submarines had reached the designated location. Before the Japanese could strike, Okinawa fell, rendering the home islands vulnerable to an Allied attack. In August 1945, Japan faced an imminent assault at its heart. To counter this threat, a plan was devised to launch an attack on the Ulithi Atoll, where 15 American aircraft carriers had gathered. The Japanese Naval General Staff believed that taking direct and immediate action was necessary to halt the American advance, considering the previous Panama Canal attack to have had little impact on the outcome of the war. The attack on Ulithi Atoll was divided into 2 phases. The first phase, codenamed Hikari, or Light, involved the transportation of 4 C-6N Sayun reconnaissance aircraft to Truk Island by I-13 and I-14. Once there, the Sayuns would be reassembled and flown over Ulithi to confirm the presence of American carriers. After completing this delivery, submarines I-13 and I-14 would proceed to Hong Kong, where they would receive 4 Seiran attack planes before continuing to Singapore for further operations. The second phase, codenamed Arashi or Storm, would see submarines I-400 and I-401 launching 6 Seiran aircraft on a kamikaze mission against the American carriers. The Seirans, armed with bombs, would fly at low altitudes to avoid radar detection and American fighter patrols. Nevertheless, before the Ulithi attack could be launched, Japan surrendered. On August 22, 1945, the crews of the submarines received orders to destroy their weapons. During the surrender, when the American destroyer Blue encountered the I-400 submarine, its sheer size astonished the U.S. crew, as she was significantly larger than any American submarine at the time.